Hello, my name is Amina. Today I wanted to talk about the books that I read in the month of October. So I read 6 books this month. Probably could have read more, but I read one book that just made me not want to read anymore. I'm sure we've probably all experienced that. Sometimes it's because you've read a book that's really, really good and you just think, I just need to fully embrace this book and just digest it before I'm ready for another book. Sometimes it's just because the book is really, really bad. This book was neither of those, but I'll talk a bit more when I get to it. So the first book that I read this month was A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. This is a non-fiction book written by Raj Patel and Jason W. Moore. I really like this book. It essentially is a history of capitalism, but it tracks 7 key things. And these 7 things are, let me just make sure I don't mix it up. So they are, nature, money, work, care, food, energy, lives. It covers quite a large part of history, including colonialism, racism, women's rights, the traditional role of women in the home and in the workplace. It's quite expansive, so it covers quite a wide range of topics. It covers this in a really good way that's really easy to understand. None of it was mind-blowing. I think it's things that we all already know, but it just presents it in such a clear way that it brings it to the forefront of your mind. And I would definitely recommend it. It's quite short and it's quite an easy read. I think it's only about 300. Yeah, it's not even 300 pages long. It's just under 200 pages long, so it's a really quick read. The second book I read was Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf. This is the book I was referring to. I don't think I even quite have my thoughts fully wrapped up on this book. It's a good book. It's a good book, but I didn't enjoy it. It was written, I think, between the First and the Second World War. And so we follow a character who is called, who refers to himself as Steppenwolf, but his name is actually Harry Haller. Harry has this sense of himself as kind of being part man and part wolf, in the sense that all the more positive aspects of his nature as a person are in this man, and the more violent, the darker parts of himself he refers to as Steppenwolf. I don't really want to go into the plot itself. It's quite bizarre and quite strange, the journey that it takes. I guess the main actual criticism I have of it is that Harry tells us so much about these dark parts of who he is and these darker parts of his personality, and he tells us how he's this outcast from society who no one accepts, and we never actually see why that is. Yes, there's a lot of telling and not a lot of actual showing us these darker parts of himself. The book is interesting. I think it's one I would say is definitely worth a read, but it's not a favourite of mine. And after I finished it, for about 2 weeks after, I just didn't want to read. And it wasn't because I hated it. It was just because I was just it was just so not hard to, I don't know how to describe it, but it just kind of left me feeling a little bit So about a couple of weeks later, I then read Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom by Cory Doctorow. I did a reading vlog on this. I thought it was a good book. It was quite short, so I think if it had been slightly longer, I could have explored more of the world. So just a brief summary, it's about a gentleman whose name I have completely forgotten, Jules. Jules lives in a world in the future where death has essentially been cured. You have clones and your memory gets transferred into these clones. It doesn't really explore that idea as much as I would have wanted. It does talk about how these clones are now the cure for everything. There was a doctor in there who his only solution for anything is just download your memory, put it in a clone. And the world itself was interesting. It was quite a short book. It's quite easy to get through, and I think it asked some interesting questions without necessarily providing any answers. The next book I completed, I read Women in Power. It's essentially 2 essays in the book, and Mary Beard is a classicist. So the first essay is about women's voices and kind of women's voices in public. And so she goes through the history from more classical literature down to the modern day in the ways that women's voices tend to be silenced, or how people do try and silence women's voices when they are trying to talk about things that are important to them. So it can be from, I can't remember the classical story she gave, but it can either be, in the classical period where sons would tell their mothers to keep quiet when they tried to complain about things, and to modern days whenever women on Twitter or on social media can have quite violent threats made against them because certain men do not agree with the things that they have said. So I thought that part was really interesting. So the second part is about women who are in power. She talks a little bit about Margaret Thatcher and other female prime ministers, and even more recently Hillary Clinton, and the kind of social media narrative that followed the two of them. And then she relates that back to some of the concepts that were seen in classical texts, including, there were some images that were going around of Hillary Clinton on Medusa's head, and what that says about what society thinks about women who are trying to go into power. It's really short. I read it in one sitting. I think it took me less than 2 hours. It's just over 100 pages long. So the next book that I read, so I actually started this as an audio book, and that is Love in the Time of Cholera. I read this for a book club that I'm in. I started off with the audiobook. I think I got probably about 100 pages in with the audiobook, and then decided to switch to an ebook version just because I could tell the writing was quite lyrical, and while I was enjoying listening to it, I just thought I was going to enjoy it more reading a physical copy. So I switched my copy to an ebook copy, and I have mixed feelings on this one. So on the one hand, I really like Marquez's writing style. I think he has such a way with words. Not only the way he uses his words, but also just the way that he weaves the story, and where he chooses to place certain parts of the story, and how he chooses to reveal information to you as a reader. I don't know if I agree with the concept of it being a love story. Like, that grates me, just because then it becomes a very disturbing piece of work. So the book essentially follows Florentino Ariza and Femina Daza. They fall in love when they are younger via correspondence, and then, the woman rejects the man. We then follow their narratives over the years until they're in their 70s. The story starts off in more when they're older, and then it goes back in time and then tells the story from there. Where I had problems was with the male character here, so Florentino Ariza. There were issues which I think you could look past, in the sense that you could see those as character flaws, which the writer has placed there as a way of showing us the effect that this heartbreak has had on him. But then there are other parts that are just plain disturbing. So essentially, towards the end, so this is a bit of a warning, towards the end it's made quite clear that, he has been sexually assaulting women, including a girl who is less than 14-year-old he is essentially groomed. Where it made me uncomfortable was it's the way that it was told in the story. It was just said very matter-of-factly. It wasn't said as a positive or a negative aspect of his character, and it was, I don't know, it just didn't sit right with me the way it was written. I think it could have been written and it could have been made clear, like, okay, this shows us that he's not a good person, but it was almost just shown as of course that's what he was going to do, like, that's a normal thing for someone to do when they get the opportunity. That was just the vibe that I got from the writing. So it left a very sour taste in my mouth. I guess another interpretation of that was maybe that is just Marquez's writing, where he's just giving the information and he's not necessarily trying to give us his commentary on that. And we are the ones that have to make our own minds up on what that means about the character. But I don't know. It just left a bad taste in my mouth, and I didn't quite know what to do with it. The final book I read was The Return of Sherlock Holmes. So I actually listened to this as an audiobook. I think it was last year where I got the entire collection on audiobook, and I've slowly been making my way through. I think in terms of his short story collections, this one was my favourite. My favourite overall is definitely The Hound of the Baskervilles. I just think that's such a great book, and it's one I feel like I just want to read every single year. So I read it last year and I read it this year, and I've read it physically as well. I finish it and I just want to restart it again. This one, so the reason this is my favourite of the short story collections is I feel like with the others, they sometimes have one or two really, really good stories, and then the rest of them are not quite as good, whereas every single one in this collection I actually really liked. None of them were amazing, but they were all like very, very like, it was consistently just good throughout. And I think because it is later on in Arthur Conan Doyle's books of Sherlock Holmes, he probably has more of a structure in place. The other thing I really liked about this one is it wasn't quite so black and white. It was more about Sherlock making assessments of situations, and he's not always necessarily the legally good person. Sometimes he's just the morally good person. One second. So he's not always the legally good character, but it's more about him trying to make moral assessments where the law might be on one side, but actually he's like, yeah, this guy killed someone, but actually the person he killed deserved it. And so I don't know, it made it a bit more interesting. Yes, I really enjoyed that one. I am currently reading, well, I've just finished The Heretics of June, and I'm just about to start a book called, what's it called? Green Days by the River, which is a book from Trinidad. Thank you for watching. Bye. Marquez's writing style. Ooh.